So anyways, this utopian scheme was set up, and we're acting on the proposition that people used it, at least in part, as a replacement for their alternative, for their old belief systems, which I think is a perfectly reasonable proposition. But we're also going to take a psychoanalytic approach, and we're going to say, well, it also allowed people to manifest bad faith, because if your worth can be determined by how good a cog you are in the fascist or communist machinery, it pretty much alleviates you of any responsibility that you have to have for your own life. So that for every positive reason that you might join a utopian movement, there's a negative reason, which is, well, you can benefit from its exploitive nature and you don't have to take any responsibility. Well, Solzhenitsyn and Frankl both talked about that a lot, as did Nietzsche, but Frankl and Solzhenitsyn are more interesting because they actually happened to live through the imposition of systems like that and could see them from the inside. Solzhenitsyn's first observation was Marxist economics didn't work. Well, that was a big problem, because it was supposed to work, and not only was it supposed to work, it was supposed to work perfectly. And what that basically meant was that if it didn't work, you only had one of two options. You could either abandon the damn system and start to complain about the fact that you had to line up for bread for 4 hours a day, which was perfectly typical daily activity for people, for example, in Poland and in Russia before the wall came down. Everything cost nothing, but there wasn't anything to buy, so it wasn't very much of a bargain. And instead of paying for your bread with money, you just paid for it with time. You stayed in line for 2 hours or 3 hours or 5 hours, and when you got to the front of the line at the department store, you took whatever the hell was there because you didn't even know what it was that you were going to be buying when you joined the lineup. And so it wasn't like it was free, you just paid for it with your time. So Solzhenitsyn noted that what happened as the system continued to manifest its counterproductive properties was that either people had the choice of saying, oh, this isn't working worth a damn, there must be something rotten in Denmark, or pretending that everything was all right and lying about everything. And that's what they did. They lied about everything, and so you got the situation up to the point where in East Germany, before the wall came down, 1 out of every 3 people was a government informer. So that meant if you had a family of 6 people, 2 of them were telling the government what you were talking about at dinner, and that was their duty. And so what that meant in these societies was no one ever said anything that they meant, ever. And if they did, the probability that the KGB was going to kick down their door at 4 in the morning and take them off to the central prison before dumping them in some damn camp where they'd never see anybody they ever knew for the rest of their life was extraordinarily high. So you watched everything you said and everything you thought around your wife, around your brother, around your sister, around your children, and the whole system ground onward in a mire of absolute deception and lie. And Solzhenitsyn's point as well, and this is one of Frankl's main points, is that if people had decided to stop lying, the system would have ground to a halt. But that isn't what people did. They just kept lying. Now he noticed when he was in the prison camps, because he was in them for a long time, he did encounter people inside the camps like Frankl did, who were absolutely unwilling to falsify their experience. So for example, one of the things that had to happen if you were arrested by the KGB and sentenced to a prison camp was that it was necessary for you to sign a confession. And that's so peculiar, eh? You think, well, they're going to arrest you arbitrarily and put you on trial for trumped up nonsense. Why couldn't they just forge your damn signature? It's like, why did they care if you confessed? And the answer to that was, well, it was part of the way the system kept itself validated, because the people who were torturing you could justify the torture if you agreed that you were actually at fault. And so rather than face the fact that they were just doing something corrupt to innocent people, they'd extract a confession out of you so that they could convince themselves that you deserved exactly what you got. Now Solzhenitsyn said at one time that one person who stopped lying could bring down a tyranny. Now that's a pretty radical statement, but you know, when he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, I mean, he memorized that damn book when he was in one of the prison camps, because they didn't give him pencil or paper, and even if they did, he wouldn't have been able to carry the damn manuscript around. So he basically memorized it, 2,700 pages, you know, written at the volume of a very loud scream, and when he got out of the prison camps, he had 2 copies of it typed up, one by one typist and one by another. They didn't know each other. The KGB broke into the one typist's home and stole the manuscript, and she killed herself. Then, well, and you can understand why, you know, she thought this was a tremendously valuable piece of work, and she thought it was the only copy, and they destroyed it. Well, he couldn't even tell her that there was another one, because they would have got it too. Well, and then it was exported to the West in unpublished form and published in English to begin with, and it was an absolute bombshell, like, and it was published in 1974. It was, at that point, anyone who had any moral integrity whatsoever and who was also literate read that and said, oh, okay, game over. All those propositions, they're wrong beyond belief, and that part of what we thought might be possible is done. Well, you know, that happened to some degree. Communism lost a tremendous amount of its intellectual credibility, and that was part of the reason that it fell over in 1989. But, you know, it's not like everybody has shaken their... No, it's not as if everyone's faith in that sort of thing has been shaken. You know, there's this massive stream of Marxist utopianism that's still running through postmodernism, and that's you know, made its way to Western universities all over the world. So, despite all of this, despite these tens of millions of deaths and this total moral corruption, and no one even knows about it, and I don't understand that. It's completely unacceptable. It's the biggest lesson of the 20th century. You know, and we hear a lot about the Holocaust, and no wonder, it was a truly terrible thing. But there's all these other events of the 20th century that were absolutely catastrophic, and they're not part of general knowledge, and you have to ask yourself why. Because if we can't learn from that, if we can't learn from all those tens of millions of people who were tortured to death and ruined in political prisons, like, you got to ask yourself, can we actually learn anything? I'm going to read you some of the things that Solzhenitsyn wrote. He doesn't say the name of this person. It's in dashes. Someone he met either in a camp or afterwards. He told how executions were carried out at Adak, a camp on the Peshora River. They would take the opposition members with their things out of the camp compound on a prisoner transport at night, and outside the compound stood the small house of the 3rd section. These were people who were opposing the communist ideology. The condemned men were taken into a room one at a time, and there the camp guards sprang on them. Their mouths were stuffed with something soft, and their arms were bound with cords behind their backs. Then they were led out into the courtyard where harnessed carts were waiting. The bound prisoners were piled on the carts, 5 to 7 at a time, and driven off to the Gorka, the camp cemetery. On arrival, they were tipped into big pits that had already been prepared and buried alive. Not out of brutality, no. It had been calculated that when dragging and lifting them, it was much easier and more efficient to cope with living people than with corpses. The work went on for many nights at Adak, and that is how the moral political unity of our party was achieved. This is from Frankl. This is the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. Those were the size of cities, by the way. I mean, when you think of camp, I don't know what image it brings up in your mind, but you know, you might think of an enclosure the size of a city block or something like that, but that's not right. These places were the size of cities, because there was tens of thousands of people in them. The most ghastly moment of the 24 hours of camp life was the awakening, when at a still nocturnal hour, the 3 shrill blows of a whistle tore us pitilessly from our exhausted sleep and from the longings in our dreams. We then began the tussle with our wet shoes, into which we could scarcely force our feet, which were sore and swollen with edema. And there were the usual moans and groans about petty troubles, such as the snapping of wires which replaced shoelaces. One morning I heard someone, whom I knew to be brave and dignified, cry like a child, because he finally had to go to the snowy marching grounds in his bare feet, as his shoes were too shrunken for him to wear. In these ghastly moments I found a little bit of comfort, a small piece of bread which I drew out of my pocket and munched with absorbed delight. This is Solzhenitsyn. So in these camps, people were set out to work, and it would depend on where they were, what they were working on, but maybe it was the digging of a canal, or maybe they were setting up a factory, or they were doing something that generally required intense physical effort. And each of these camps had a goal, right, that was established from above. It's like a 5-year plan. Your camp is to produce this much in this period of time, and then if you didn't produce that much in that period of time, then the people who ran the camp were going to be held accountable, which generally meant that they were going to be put in some camp themselves. And so there was every reason to drive people to their death in order to fulfill the work norms, and when that didn't happen, they just falsified the records anyways, because what the hell was their choice? And Solzhenitsyn talks about how they got around the rules. In cold lower than 60 degrees below zero, workdays were written off. In other words, on such days, the records showed that the workers had not gone out to work. Well, so then you can tell a bit about the benevolence of the Soviet state. If it was 55 below, well then you could go out to work, but if it was 60 below, you got to stay home. Well, that isn't even how it worked. In other words, on 60 below days, the records showed that the workers had not gone to work, but they chased them out anyways. And whatever they squeezed out of them on those days was added to the other days, thereby raising the percentages. And the servile medical section wrote off those who froze to death on such cold days on some other basis. And the ones who were left, who could no longer walk and were straining every sinew to crawl along on all fours on the way back to camp, the convoy simply shot so that they wouldn't escape before they could come back to get them. So Stalin had a group of people, hundreds of thousands of people, dig a canal in the 1930s, and unfortunately I can't remember the name of the canal, but some 300,000 people froze to death digging it with spades and shovels in the middle of the Russian winter, and when it was finished it was so shallow that none of the ships that were planned to go up and down it could use it. But it got finished even though it was the middle of the winter. This is from William Blake. O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm hath found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. This is another story from Solzhenitsyn about a women's camp. He's standing in another camp watching this occur because the women, of course, were put in a camp separate from the men. Fire, fire. The branches crackle and the night wind of late autumn blows the flame of the bonfire back and forth. The compound is dark. I'm alone at the bonfire, and I can bring it still some more carpenter's shavings. The compound that I'm in is a privileged one, so privileged that it is almost as if I were out in freedom. This is an island of paradise. This is the Marfino Sharashka, which was a scientific institute staffed with prisoners. In its most privileged period. No one is overseeing me, calling me to a cell, chasing me away from the bonfire. And even then it is chilly in the penetrating wind. But she, who has already been standing in the wind for hours, her arms straight down, her head drooping, weeping, then growing numb and still. And then again she begs piteously, "Citizen Chief, please forgive me, I won't do it again." The wind carries her moan to me just as if she were moaning next to my ear. The Citizen Chief at the gatehouse fires up his stove and does not answer. This was the gatehouse of the camp next to us, from which workers came into our compound to lay water pipes and repair the old ramshackle seminary building. Across from me, beyond the artfully intertwined, many-stranded barbed wire barricade and 2 steps away from the gatehouse, beneath a bright lantern stood the punished girl, head hanging, the wind tugging at her gray work skirt, her feet growing numb from the cold, and a thin scarf over her head. It had been warm during the day when they had been digging a ditch on our territory, and another girl slipped down into a ravine, crawled her way to the Vladikino highway, and escaped. The guard had bungled, and Moscow city buses ran right along the highway. When they caught on, it was too late to catch her, so they raised the alarm. A mean, dark major arrived and shouted that if they failed to catch the girl, The entire camp would be deprived of visits and parcels for a whole month because of her escape. And the women brigadiers went into a rage, and they were all shouting, one of them in particular, who kept viciously rolling her eyes. "Oh, I hope they catch her, the bitch. I hope they take scissors and take off all of her hair in front of the lineup." This wasn't something she had thought up for herself. This is the way they punished women in the Gulag. But the girl who was now standing outside the gatehouse in the cold had sighed and said instead, "At least she can have a good time out in freedom for all of us." The jailer overheard what she said, and now she was being punished. Everyone else had been taken off to the camp, but she had been set outside there to stand at attention in front of the gatehouse. This had been at 6 p.m., and now it was 11 p.m. She tried to shift from one foot to another, but the guard stuck out his head and shouted, "Stand at attention, whore, or else it will be worse for you." And now she was not moving, only weeping. "Forgive me, citizen chief. Let me into the camp. I won't do it anymore." But even in the camp, no one was about to say to her, "All right, idiot, come on in." The reason they were keeping her out there anyway for so long was that the next day was Sunday and she wouldn't be needed for work. Such a straw blonde, naive, uneducated slip of a girl. She'd been imprisoned for some spool of thread. What a dangerous thought you expressed there, little sister. They want to teach you a lesson for the rest of your life. Fire. Fire. We fought the war and we looked into the bonfires to see what kind of victory it would be. The wind wafted a glowing husk from the bonfire. To that flame in you, girl, I promise the whole world will read about you. This is from Milton, Paradise Lost. For whence but from the author of all ill could spring so deep a malice to confound the race of mankind in one root, and earth with hell to mingle and involve, done all to spite the great Creator. What are the political implications of existential psychology? If you lie, you corrupt the system. If you lie enough, the system becomes so corrupt that it turns on you and becomes murderous. So the price of freedom, as far as the existentialists are concerned, and this is buttressed by the historical knowledge that they garnered during the 20th century, was that you have a moral obligation. You have a moral obligation to speak the truth, to maintain the integrity of the state, as well as fostering your own psychological integration.